Let me tell you about the day the galaxy's most feared apex predator walked into a third-grade classroom and had his entire worldview shattered by a 5'2" human woman with a coffee mug that read "World's okayest teacher." But first, some context. Because apparently, the Galactic Council thought it would be a brilliant idea to create the Galactic Education Exchange Program. You know, let's take the most diverse collection of species in known space and throw their kids together in a classroom. What could possibly go wrong? Mr. Elena Rodriguez had volunteered for this program with the naive optimism that only comes from 10 years of teaching human children. She figured, how different could alien kids really be? Spoiler alert, very different. Very, very different. Are you sure about the species? Her classroom on Harmony Prime space station looked like someone had dumped a crayon box into a blender and hit the chaos setting. There was Zeph, a nervous little crystalline who literally vibrated at frequencies that made the windows hum whenever he got anxious, which was always. The kid was basically a living tuning fork with separation anxiety. Then there was Mook, a young Thraxian warrior who stood 3 feet tall but had the attitude of a general planning his next conquest. His species believed that proper education involved at least 12 combat scenarios before lunch. Mook kept asking when they were going to learn about tactical flanking maneuvers. Ms. Rodriguez kept explaining that the only flanking they'd be doing was around the alphabet chart. Don't even get me started on Pip, the fluffernutter whose species communicated primarily through interpretive dance and color-changing fur. Trying to figure out if she needed to use the bathroom or was just expressing her feelings about Tuesday had become Ms. Rodriguez's daily cardio workout. The tentacloid twins, Squish and Splash, had the adorable habit of accidentally phasing through solid matter when they got excited, which meant that every time someone got a gold star, Ms. Rodriguez had to fish them out of the floor. Again. And then there was little Beep, whose species apparently evolved from living computers. The kids spoke only in binary, beeped constantly, and had already hacked into the station's coffee maker to dispense hot chocolate instead. Ms. Rodriguez wasn't even mad about that one. Honestly. Managing this cosmic zoo while trying to teach basic addition, the alphabet, and the fundamentals of not eating your classmates had pushed Ms. Rodriguez to develop skills she never knew she possessed, like telepathically sensing when Mook was about to challenge someone to honorable combat over the last juice box, or knowing exactly which frequency of voice would calm Zeph down before he shattered every piece of glass in a 3-corridor radius. It was Tuesday morning, which in Ms. Rodriguez's experience was the universe's way of saying Monday wasn't quite terrible enough. She was trying to mediate a dispute between Pip and one of the tentacloid twins over sharing crayons, when her communication pad chimed with a message from the administration. "Ooh, what fresh hell is this?" she muttered, reading the notification. Her coffee mug seemed to mock her with its cheerful dishonesty. The message was brief and ominous. Special guest student arriving today for cultural exchange observation. Species, Shadow Maw. Name, Crix. Please prepare accordingly. Mrs. Rodriguez blinked, then blinked again. Shadow Maws weren't exactly known for their educational pursuits. They were known for being the apex predators of the Andromeda sector, the thing parents told their kids about to make them behave, the species that made hardened space pirates check under their bunks at night. "Well," she said, taking a long sip of her coffee, "this should be interesting." She looked around at her current students, blissfully unaware of what was coming. Zeph was humming nervously while organizing his pencils by molecular weight. Mook was practicing his war cry, which sounded more like a squeaky toy than anything intimidating. The twins were successfully staying corporeal for once, and Beep was beeping what she was pretty sure translated to the Macarena. Ms. Rodriguez had handled screaming toddlers, helicopter parents, and budget cuts that would make a accountant weep. She'd survived the Great Glitter Incident of 2387 and the legendary food fight that resulted in the cafeteria being declared a hazmat zone. How hard could one more student be? The answer to that question arrived at precisely 9:47 a.m., announced by the sound of heavy footsteps that seemed to echo through the station's hull itself. Even the background hum of the life support system seemed to quiet down, as if the machinery itself was holding its breath. The classroom door slid open with a hiss that sounded far more ominous than usual, and in walked 8 feet of pure nightmare fuel. Crix was everything the holovids made Shadow Maws out to be, and then some. Imagine if someone took a panther, fed it nothing but protein shakes and aggression for about 10 years, then decided it needed more teeth and fewer morals. His obsidian black exoskeleton gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and when he moved, it was with the fluid grace of something that had never met a prey animal it couldn't catch. His head was elongated and predatory, with rows of crystalline teeth that caught the light like tiny daggers. 6 arms ending in razor-sharp claws that could probably slice through the station's hull if he felt like it. And his eyes. Oh, his eyes were the real showstopper. 4 of them, glowing like molten gold, scanning the room with the calculated precision of something deciding which target looked most appetizing. The reaction from Ms. Rodriguez's students was immediate and instinctive. Zeph's crystalline body went from his usual nervous humming to a high-pitched whine that made the windows vibrate in their frames. He literally tried to make himself invisible by refracting light around his body, which just resulted in a very obvious, very terrified rainbow shimmer cowering behind his desk. Mook, the proud little Thraxian warrior who had spent the morning practicing his battle stance, took one look at Crix and immediately dropped into what could only be described as the galactic equivalent of playing dead. He hit the floor so fast he bounced. The tentacloid twins didn't even bother with their usual excited babbling. They phase-shifted directly through their chairs and into the floor, presumably hoping to find somewhere in the station's substructure where apex predators couldn't reach them. Pip's fur cycled through about 17 different colors in 3 seconds, finally settling on a shade that Ms. Rodriguez was pretty sure meant, "Please don't eat me in Fluffernutter." Even Beep stopped beeping. When a living computer goes silent, you know things are serious. The silence stretched for exactly 2.7 seconds, which in classroom time is approximately 17 years. Crix surveyed his new domain with obvious satisfaction. His nostrils flared, probably picking up the scent of fear, which for a shadow maw was basically like walking into a bakery and smelling fresh cookies. His claws flexed experimentally, and his head tilted in that predatory way that usually preceded something becoming lunch. This was his moment. The apex predator had arrived, and the natural order was asserting itself. Every instinct in his genetically superior body was telling him that this was going exactly as it should. Fear was the proper response to his presence. Submission was expected. Dominance was his birthright. He opened his mouth to release what was probably going to be some sort of intimidating roar that would cement his position at the top of the food chain. Instead, what came out was, hello? I'm here for the cultural exchange thing? Because nothing kills your apex predator mystique quite like uncertainty and a slight speech impediment that makes you sound like you're asking for directions to the bathroom. Ms. Rodriguez looked up from her coffee mug, gave him the same once-over she'd give any new student, and said, "You must be Crix. I'm Ms. Rodriguez. You're 7 minutes late." That was it. No screaming, no cowering, no immediate submission to his obvious genetic superiority. Just a slightly annoyed teacher with a coffee stain on her cardigan, looking at him like he was any other kid who'd wandered in after the bell. Crix blinked all 4 eyes in sequence, which was his species' equivalent of a double-take. This was not how this was supposed to go. Where was the terror, the awe, the immediate acknowledgement of his position as the ultimate predator? There was traffic in the docking bay, he offered weakly. Uh-huh, Miss Rodriguez said, making a note on her pad. Well, we're just starting morning circle. Why don't you find a seat and we'll get you caught up? She gestured vaguely toward the cluster of tiny plastic chairs arranged in a circle on the rainbow-colored carpet. Chairs that were clearly designed for beings significantly smaller than 8 feet of apex predator. Crix stared at the chairs, then at Ms. Rodriguez, then at the chairs again. This was definitely not covered in his species' genetic memory. Crix decided to fall back on what he knew best. When in doubt, assert dominance. It was right there in the Shadow Maw Handbook, Chapter 1, Page 1, written in the blood of lesser species. He drew himself up to his full 8 feet of terrifying height, expanded his shoulder spikes to their most intimidating configuration, and let out what should have been a bone-chilling roar that would send every creature in the room scrambling for the exits. What actually came out was more of a confused growl that sounded like he was asking a question. But still, the intent was there. The other students, who had been starting to peek out from their various hiding spots, immediately disappeared again. Zeph's rainbow shimmer winked out entirely. Somewhere under the floor, the tentacloid twins made muffled whimpering sounds. Ms. Rodriguez looked up from her attendance sheet with the expression of someone who had seen this exact behavior from countless students before. "Excuse me, Crix," she said in that particular teacher voice that somehow managed to be both patient and absolutely done with your nonsense. "We use our inside voices in the classroom." Inside voices. Crix's 4 eyes blinked in asynchronous confusion. He was a apex predator. He didn't have inside voices. He had intimidation roars, battle cries, and the occasional victory howl after a successful hunt. Those were his voices. "But I'm establishing dominance," he said, which came out sounding more like a whine than he intended. "The only thing you need to establish right now is your position in that chair," Ms. Rodriguez replied, pointing again at the circle of tiny plastic seats. "We're about to start sharing time and everyone needs to participate." Sharing time? Crix's genetic memory was really failing him here. His ancestors had shared exactly 3 things: fear, death, and the occasional territory dispute. None of those seemed appropriate for a classroom setting. He tried a different approach. Slowly, deliberately, he extended his claws to their full razor-sharp length and began what his species called the intimidation display. It involved a lot of careful claw clicking, some strategic shoulder movements and eye positioning that had made entire star systems surrender without firing a shot. Ms. Rodriguez watched this performance with the same interest she might show a particularly lackluster school play. "That's very nice, dear," she said when he finished. "Now about that seat." Deer? Deer? He was the apex predator of the Andromeda sector, the nightmare that haunted the dreams of lesser species, the evolutionary pinnacle of hunting perfection, and she just called him deer? This called for the nuclear option. Crix locked all 4 of his golden eyes directly onto Ms. Rodriguez, and deployed what his species simply called the stare. It was a predator's gaze, refined over millions of years of evolution, designed to trigger every prey response in the galaxy. Knees should be shaking, breathing should be becoming difficult, the primitive parts of her brain should be screaming at her to run. Ms. Rodriguez stared right back. And this is where Kix discovered something that would haunt him for the rest of his days. There is no predator in the known galaxy more terrifying than an elementary school teacher who has reached the limit of her patience. Her brown eyes didn't waver. They didn't blink. They certainly didn't show fear. Instead, they held the accumulated power of 10 years spent dealing with sugar-high 7-year-olds, budget meetings with administrators, and parents who thought their precious little angels could do no wrong. This was the stare that had made the mayor's kid confess to putting gum in someone's hair, the look that had convinced the Henderson twins that maybe, just maybe, they didn't want to find out what happened to children who didn't listen to Ms. Rodriguez. For the first time in his apex predator life, Crix felt something he'd never experienced before. He wanted to apologize. "Crix," Ms. Rodriguez said, and her voice had dropped about half an octave into what teachers everywhere recognize as the tone of final warning. "I'm going to count to 3. Crix had faced down space pirates, territorial disputes with other apex predators, and once, memorably, an entire fleet of angry galactic peacekeepers. None of them had ever counted to 3 in that particular voice. He had no idea what happened when she reached 3, but every instinct he possessed was screaming that he really, really didn't want to find out. "Oh." His claws retracted involuntarily. 2. His shoulder spikes deflated like sad balloons. 2.5. Crix practically dove for the nearest tiny plastic chair. What followed was possibly the most undignified moment in apex predator history. The chair was designed for beings approximately 3 feet tall and roughly humanoid in shape. Crix was 8 feet of angular predator with 6 arms, spikes, and a tail that had its own zip code. Watching him try to fit into that chair was like watching someone attempt to fold an origami crane out of a small mountain. He started by trying to sit normally, which resulted in his knees somewhere around his ears and his tail wrapped around the chair like a very confused snake. 2 of his arms dangled uselessly while the other 4 tried to find somewhere to go that wasn't either stabbing him with his own spikes or accidentally clawing holes in the carpet. "Comfortable?" Ms. Rodriguez asked with the kind of polite concern that suggested she was enjoying this far more than was professionally appropriate. "Perfectly," Crix lied through gritted teeth that could have cut glass. Something in his left shoulder was making a clicking sound that definitely hadn't been there this morning, and he was pretty sure one of his spikes was stuck in the chair back. The other students had cautiously emerged from their hiding spots, apparently realizing that if the apex predator was folded into a pretzel on a plastic chair, he probably wasn't an immediate threat. They watched with the fascinated horror of children witnessing something both terrible and hilarious. "Wonderful," Ms. Rodriguez said, settling into her own chair with practiced ease. "Now, Crix, why don't you tell us a little about yourself? What do you like to do for fun?" This was a trap. It had to be. Crix's idea of fun involved hunting, stalking, the occasional territorial dispute, and perfecting new and creative ways to terrify lesser life forms. None of which seemed appropriate for sharing time. I enjoy physical activities, he ventured. Like what? Prompted Ms. Rodriguez. Hunting, he said automatically, then immediately regretted it when several students made alarmed squeaking noises. I mean, hunting for knowledge. Educational hunting. Very safe hunting. Ms. Rodriguez nodded as if this made perfect sense. And what's your favorite subject? Kirk's mind went blank. Favorite subject? The only subjects he'd ever studied were advanced intimidation, predator psychology, and a graduate course in making other species regret their life choices. Combat? He tried weakly. We call that physical education here, Ms. Rodriguez said smoothly. How lovely. And do you have any hobbies? Hobbies. Right. Normal people had hobbies. What did normal people do when they weren't establishing their position at the top of the food chain? I collect things, he said, which was technically true. He collected the territories of defeated rivals, but she didn't need to know that. What kind of things? Shiny things, pretty things, things that other people used to own. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that makes you realize you may have said something wrong. I see, Ms. Rodriguez said in that carefully neutral teacher voice. Well, we'll need to talk about the importance of asking before we take things that belong to others. Ask? Ask for things? Crick's worldview took another hit. In his experience, you didn't ask for things. You were either strong enough to take them or you weren't. The concept of politely requesting someone's territory before conquering it had never occurred to him. Now then, Ms. Rodriguez continued, apparently deciding to move past the concerning implications of his hobby collection, I think it's time we went over the classroom rules. Rules. Crick's new rules. Rules were simple. Be the biggest, scariest thing in the room and everyone else would figure out their place in the hierarchy. These rules, however, seemed to be somewhat different. Rule number 1, Ms. Rodriguez began. We keep our hands, feet, claws, tentacles, energy appendages, and any other body parts to ourselves. Crick looked down at his 6 arms, currently tangled around the tiny chair like he was hugging it to death. This rule already seemed problematic. Rule number 2, we use kind words with our friends. Kind words? The kindest thing he'd ever said to another being was, I'll make this quick, right before establishing dominance over their territory. Rule number 3, we raise our hand when we want to speak. Which hand? He had 6 of them. Was there a specific hand-raising protocol for multi-armed species? What if he raised the wrong hand? Rule number 4, we listen when others are talking. This one seemed manageable. He was good at listening, mostly for sounds of approaching prey or rival predators, but listening was listening. And rule number 5, Ms. Rodriguez said, fixing him with that terrifying teacher stare again. We remember that everyone in this classroom is here to learn and grow, and we treat each other with respect. Respect. Crick understood respect. You respected things that could kill you, but these tiny, fragile little beings around him couldn't hurt a spacefly. How was he supposed to respect something he could accidentally sneeze on and eliminate? As if reading his thoughts, Ms. Rodriguez leaned forward slightly. Crick, she said in that patient voice that somehow made him feel smaller than a cosmic dust particle, do you think you can follow these rules? Looking into her eyes, surrounded by students who had stopped cowering and were now watching him with curious interest rather than terror, wedged into a chair that was doing things to his skeletal structure that probably violated several laws of physics, Crick realized something profound. He was completely and utterly outmatched. Yes, Ms. Rodriguez, he said in a voice so meek it would have made his ancestors weep with shame. Excellent, she said, and her smile was warm and terrifying in equal measure. Now, who wants to show Crick where we keep the art supplies? What followed was the most comprehensive dismantling of an apex predator's self-persona in galactic history, delivered via finger paints and construction paper. Art time, it turned out, was Crick's personal nightmare. His razor-sharp claws, perfectly designed for rending flesh and establishing dominance, were absolutely useless for holding a paintbrush. Every time he tried to grip the tiny wooden handle, he either snapped it in half or accidentally launched it across the room like a very small, very colorful projectile. Here, let me help, said Pip, the little fluffernutter whose fur had finally settled into a helpful shade of pink. She demonstrated the proper brush grip with her tiny paws, speaking in the patient voice of someone explaining something very obvious to someone very slow. Crick, the terror of the Andromeda sector, was being given art lessons by a creature that looked like a cross between a teddy bear and a rainbow. See? You hold it like this and then you just paint. Pip said, creating a cheerful yellow flower on her paper. Crix attempted to replicate her technique. What emerged on his paper looked less like a flower and more like something that had died violently and been left in the sun too long. That's very abstract, Ms. Rodriguez said, appearing beside his desk with that teacher ability to materialize wherever chaos was brewing. What is it? It's supposed to be a flower, Crix muttered, all 6 arms now covered in paint up to what would have been his elbows if apex predators had elbows. I can see that, she lied, with the smooth confidence of someone who had been interpreting child art for a decade. Very creative use of, is that supposed to be red? Or did you bleed on it? It's red paint, Crix said quickly, though given that his species had dark purple blood, the distinction was academic. Wonderful. Why don't you try adding some green for the stem? The green stem somehow turned into what looked like a crime scene. Crix stared at his artistic disaster and felt something he'd never experienced before. The desire to crumple up his work and hide under the desk. But before he could retreat into shame, little Zeph's crystalline voice chimed in. The nervous Crystalline had apparently overcome his terror enough to lean over and examine Crix's painting. I like the way you made the petals all spiky, Zeph said, his body humming with what Crix was learning to recognize as excitement rather than fear. It looks fierce, like a warrior flower. A warrior flower. Crix looked at his disaster of a painting with new eyes. Maybe it wasn't a complete failure. Maybe it was just aggressive art. Yeah, piped up Mook from across the circle, his earlier terror completely forgotten in the face of potential violence. It looks like it could bite someone. Can flowers bite people? 'Cause that one totally could. For the first time since entering the classroom, Crix felt a tiny flutter of something that might have been pride. The feeling lasted exactly until sharing circle. Sharing circle, Ms. Rodriguez explained, was when everyone sat in their tiny plastic chairs and talked about their feelings. Their feelings. Crix had exactly 3 feelings that he was aware of. Hungry, territorial, and victorious. None of these seemed appropriate for sharing time. Who would like to go first today? Ms. Rodriguez asked. Every hand, tentacle, and appendage in the room shot up except Crix's. He was still trying to figure out which of his 6 arms he was supposed to raise and in what order. Beep, why don't you start? The little computer being launched into a series of beeps, boops, and electronic whirs that Miss Rodriguez somehow translated as, Beep is excited about the new space station cafeteria menu, but concerned about the nutritional value of synthetic proteins. This was sharing? Discussing cafeteria food? Crix's species shared territories through ritualized combat. This was just talking about lunch. One by one, his classmates shared their thoughts, feelings, and concerns. The tentacloid twins were worried about their upcoming dentist appointment. Pip was excited about her family's vacation to the Crystal Gardens. Mook was disappointed that they weren't going to learn siege tactics until next semester. And then it was Crix's turn. All eyes turned to him. Some still held traces of fear, but mostly they looked curious, expectant, like they actually wanted to hear what he had to say. Crix began, then stopped. What was he supposed to share? That he missed the simple days when problems were solved through intimidation and superior firepower? That he was confused by the concept of asking permission before taking things? That he was starting to suspect his entire worldview might be fundamentally flawed? I'm confused, he finally admitted. The words hung in the air like a confession. Apex predators weren't supposed to be confused. They were supposed to be confident, dominant, absolutely certain of their place in the universe. What are you confused about? Ms. Rodriguez asked gently. Everything, Crix said, and the honesty of it surprised him. I don't understand why you're not afraid of me. I don't understand why everyone is being nice to me. I don't understand art, or sharing, or why I need to raise my hand to talk. Where I come from, things are simpler. How so? You're strong, or you're not. You're scary, or you get eaten. You take what you want, or you don't deserve to have it. He looked around the circle of tiny faces watching him. But none of you are scary, and you're all still here. And you have things. But you didn't take them from anyone. And you're nice to each other, even when you don't have to be. The classroom was quiet, except for Zeph's soft humming and the background whir of the station's life support. And that confuses you? Miss Rodriguez asked. It confuses me, because I think I like it better this way, Crix said, and the admission felt like jumping off a cliff. I like that Pip helped me with my painting. I like that Zeph said nice things about my warrior flower. I like that nobody tried to establish dominance over anybody else. He paused, looking down at his paint-covered claws. I think I've been doing things wrong for a very long time. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that happens when something important has been said, and everyone needs a moment to process it. Finally, Mook spoke up. It's okay, the little Thraxian warrior said seriously. I used to think everything had to be about fighting too, but Ms. Rodriguez taught me that there are different kinds of strength. Like what? Crix asked. Like being kind when you don't have to be, Pip said, her fur shifting to a warm golden color. Or helping someone even if they can't help you back. Or admitting when you don't know something, added Zeph, his crystalline body chiming softly. That takes courage. Crix looked around the circle at these small, supposedly helpless creatures, and realized they were teaching him something his genetic programming had never covered. Maybe being the biggest, scariest thing in the room wasn't the only way to be strong. Maybe, just maybe, there was something to be said for being the kindest. The transformation of Crix from apex predator to model student didn't happen overnight, but it happened fast enough to give everyone cosmic whiplash. By the end of the first week, he had mastered the art of raising exactly one hand at a time when he wanted to speak. He'd chosen his upper right arm as his designated speaking appendage, which he now lifted with the careful precision of someone performing delicate surgery. Mr. Rodriguez, he said during science time, his hand raised so perfectly straight it could have been used as a ruler. May I please share my observation about the plant growth experiment? Ms. Rodriguez, who was still adjusting to having the galaxy's most feared predator asking permission to speak about bean sprouts, nodded encouragingly. I noticed that the plant in the dark grew taller but weaker, Crix reported, with the serious demeanor of someone presenting crucial intelligence data. I believe this is because it was stretching to find light, but without proper illumination it couldn't develop structural integrity. The other students nodded along as if this was perfectly normal behavior from someone who could theoretically eat them all as a light snack. That's an excellent observation, Crix, Ms. Rodriguez said, making a note on her tablet. Can you think of any connections between the plant's behavior and other things we've learned? Crix considered this with the same intensity he once brought to hunting strategies. Well, it reminds me of what we talked about in social studies, how societies that try to grow too fast without strong foundations often collapse. And also what Pip shared yesterday about how her cousin grew really tall really fast, but kept falling over until he learned to balance properly. The fact that he was making interdisciplinary connections between botany, sociology, and fluffernutter family anecdotes would have impressed any education professional. The fact that he was doing it while carefully keeping his claws retracted so he didn't accidentally shred his desk was just a bonus. By the second week, Crix had become the unofficial classroom protector, but not in the way anyone expected. Instead of using his intimidating presence to scare off threats, he used it to make sure everyone felt safe and included. When the new student arrived, a tiny glimmerwing whose species was naturally prey to just about everything in the galaxy, the little being took one look around the classroom and immediately tried to hide under the supply cabinet. Hey, Crix said, carefully folding all 6 of his arms and lowering himself to floor level so he wouldn't seem so imposing. I'm Crix. What's your name? The glimmerwing's wings fluttered nervously, casting prismatic patterns on the walls. Sparkle, came a voice so quiet it was barely a whisper. That's a really pretty name, Crix said, and meant it. I was scared when I first got here too. You were scared? Sparkle's compound eyes focused on him with disbelief. But you're a shadow maw. Yeah, but Ms. Rodriguez is scarier, Crix said matter-of-factly. Want me to show you where we keep the good crayons? Pip taught me that there are different qualities of crayons, and if you know where to look, you can find the ones that don't break when you press too hard. Within 10 minutes, Sparkle was settled at a desk between Crix and Pip, carefully coloring what appeared to be a very detailed rainbow, while Crix provided helpful commentary on color theory and crayon pressure techniques. The purple works better if you color in small circles instead of long strokes, he was saying, demonstrating on his own paper with the careful attention of someone disarming a bomb. See how it builds up the color more evenly? Mrs. Rodriguez watched this interaction while sipping her coffee and wondering if she should add apex predator rehabilitation to her resume. The real test came during the 3rd week, when Tommy Hendricks arrived. Tommy Hendricks was human, 8 years old, and possessed of the kind of confidence that only comes from being told you're special every day of your life, without ever having to prove it. He walked into the classroom like he owned it, which, given his father's position on the Galactic Council, wasn't entirely inaccurate. He took one look around the room, sneered at the collection of alien students, and announced, "My dad says aliens are weird and smell funny." The classroom went dead silent. Even beeps stopped beeping. Crix felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't experienced in weeks. It was familiar and warm and had to do with establishing dominance through superior firepower. For just a moment, his claws extended involuntarily. Then he looked at Sparkle, who had gone very still beside him. At Zeph, whose humming had taken on an anxious frequency. At Pip, whose fur had shifted to a hurt muted gray. Crix made a choice. "That's not very nice," he said, his voice calm but carrying an undertone that made Tommy take an involuntary step backward. "Everyone here is my friend, and I don't like it when people are mean to my friends." "Yeah, well, what are you going to do about it?" Tommy shot back, apparently not recognizing that he was mouthing off to something that could use him as a toothpick. Crix stood up, slowly, unfolding to his full 8 feet of apex predator magnificence. His 4 golden eyes fixed on Tommy with laser focus. His shoulder spikes extended slightly. For just a moment, he let Tommy see exactly what he was dealing with. Tommy went very, very pale. Then Crix smiled, and it was the kind of smile that showed a lot of very sharp teeth. "Certainly, I'm going to tell Ms. Rodriguez," he said sweetly. The anticlimactic nature of this threat somehow made it infinitely more terrifying than any violence could have been. Tommy looked around the classroom, perhaps finally noticing that everyone else seemed perfectly comfortable with having an apex predator as their classroom protector, and apparently decided that maybe, just maybe, he should reassess his approach to interspecies relations. "Ms. Rodriguez," Crix said, raising his designated speaking hand, "Tommy said something mean about my friends. I think he might need to learn about our classroom rules." What followed was a 15-minute educational experience that left Tommy with a much deeper appreciation for the diversity of galactic civilization and a new understanding of why his father's opinions might not represent the cutting edge of diplomatic thinking. By the end of the month, Crix had become something unprecedented, a fully socialized apex predator. He helped Zeph with math by calculating crystal resonance frequencies. He partnered with the Tentacloid twins for science projects, using his multiple arms to hold equipment while they manipulated it with their phase-shifting abilities. He and Mook had developed an elaborate play routine that involved Mook conquering various classroom territories, while Crix played the role of wise advisor who suggests diplomatic solutions. He even learned to finger paint without destroying the paper, though his artistic style still tended toward what art critics might call aggressively abstract. But the real measure of his transformation came on Friday afternoon, when the announcement came over the intercom that his cultural exchange period was ending, and he would be returning to his home system the following week. The classroom erupted in protests. "But he just learned how to use the glue stick properly," Pip wailed, her fur cycling through several shades of distress. "Who's going to help me reach the high shelves?" demanded one of the Tentacloid twins. "He still hasn't finished his friendship bracelet project," Sparkle pointed out, wings fluttering anxiously. Crix looked around at his classmates, these small, supposedly helpless creatures who had somehow become the most important beings in his universe, and felt something crack in his chest. "I don't want to leave," he said, and his voice was very small for something that could level a building. Ms. Rodriguez looked at her most unlikely student, this 8-foot predator who now carefully raised his hand before speaking and had learned to share snacks without asserting territorial dominance, and made a decision that would probably require a lot of paperwork. "Well then," she said, pulling up a communications screen, "I suppose we'll have to see about extending your cultural exchange program. After all, you still haven't mastered cursive writing." The cheer that went up from the classroom could probably be heard 3 sectors away. That evening, as Crix carefully packed his art supplies and homework assignments into a backpack designed for beings much smaller than himself, he reflected on everything that had changed. A month ago, he had been the apex predator of the Andromeda sector, feared throughout the galaxy, secure in his position at the top of the food chain. Now he was a 3rd grader who got excited about library time and had strong opinions about the proper way to organize crayons by color intensity. And he had never been happier. As he settled into his oversized sleeping mat that the custodial staff had provided, Crix thought about tomorrow's schedule. They were going to start learning about fractions in math, continue their unit on friendship in social studies, and Ms. Rodriguez had promised they could use the good scissors for art time. For a brief moment, he wondered what his ancestors would think of him now. Then he decided he didn't care. His ancestors had never experienced the joy of successfully completing a word search puzzle, or the pride of helping a friend reach something on a high shelf. His ancestors had never learned that there were different kinds of strength, and that sometimes the strongest thing you could do was admit you were wrong and try to do better. They had never discovered that being the kindest creature in the room was infinitely more satisfying than being the scariest. From down the hall came Ms. Rodriguez's voice as she finished her evening reports. Note to file: Crix continues to exceed expectations in classroom integration. Recommend permanent transfer to educational track. Also need to requisite larger furniture. Crix smiled in the darkness, showing rows of sharp teeth that no longer seemed quite so frightening. Tomorrow was show and tell, and he had the perfect thing to share. A story about how he had learned that the most dangerous predator in the galaxy wasn't something with claws and fangs. It was a teacher with a coffee mug, infinite patience, and the absolute certainty that every student, no matter what species or how many teeth they had, could learn to be better than they were yesterday. And sometimes, if you were very, very lucky, that teacher might even call you dear,